Hello, can you please stop the recording, or what is it, the video? Okay, while we are waiting for the short course series to start, I would like to firstly talk with our participants for today's, yeah. I see from the names of the participants, I guess all the participants are my students from English Education. I would like to know your response, yeah. Now we are in the fourth sessions of the short course series. So how do you find the program? Anyone would like to share or give a response to the program? Alfian, I see Alfian's on the list of the participants. Hello. Hello, Alfian Fazri. Okay, can you please unmute yourself and talk and respond to me directly? So, Alfian, I see your response on the chat, but I want you to talk directly to me so we can have a conversations, short conversations while waiting for 1 minute or 2 minutes before we start our short course series. Yeah, Alfian, how do you find the program? Hello, is my voice clear? Oh, Pak Eko or Nugi, can you hear me clearly?
Yes,
I'm
ma'am.
afraid.
Yes,
Okay,
ma'am.
okay,
Your voice is clearly.
Okay, I'm
Voice is
afraid.
clear.
Yeah, I have a problem with my connections. Yeah.
Very well.
Sophia, no response from my students. or Rizka. Or Rindu, or I don't know whether Rindu is students of English Education. Yeah. The most active participant so far. Yeah.
Yes, Miss.
So who is it? Who is
Rizka, Miss.
Oh,
I'm
Rizka.
from
Okay,
Untitled.
yeah, Rizka. How do you find the program, or what's your opinion about the programs?
I found a program from Mr. Udi from group MK Academic Writing.
Yeah.
And I think it's
So
this
how do you
program
find
is
it?
very good for our research in Indonesia ya, Miss.
Okay, please. No worries.
Terutama aku semester 6 kayak buat prepare aja gitu buat research aku ke depannya. Jadi aku ikut join ke short course online ini.
Okay, so far, you get any idea from the topics for your future thesis or your research proposal? Have you got any
Saat
ideas?
ini
Not yet.
belum sih, Miss.
Not yet.
Aku baru ngikutin aja dulu.
Okay. That's okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for the response. Yeah, Rizka
Yes,
Adilia. Okay. It's 1:30 already. Okay, Pa Hilmi, I saw Pa Hilmi here. Okay, Pa Hilmi. Yeah, you may start the sessions, please.
Okay, yes, I'm here, Budina. Thank you so much. Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay, welcome back again in our online short course series 4 with Dr. Udi Samanhudi. Good afternoon, Dr. Udi. How are you today?
Very good, Ilmi. Thank you very much. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
I know you are busy. Thank you very much for still being
No,
with
not
us.
really. Always busy.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, in this second session, we're going to continue hearing from Dr. Udi, okay, in which he will expound it more. He will expound more about narrative inquiry. So before I hand it over to Dr. Udi, I would like to review a little bit what he discussed yesterday. Yesterday, he discussed about narrative inquiry as a form of qualitative research, and then narrative inquiry, and in which the elicitation method is oral narrative, and then the third one talking about ethical issue in narrative inquiry. So I would like to highlight about narrative inquiry yesterday he discussed. So everything, every data that has a story, it's a narrative. Am I right, Dr. Ravi?
Right. Yeah, correct.
And what the narrative researcher should do is just two things. Okay, just be very sensitive with the story. Okay, and focus on the content. So we are not creating the content. It's not a narrative researcher do. It's YouTuber's job to create the content, right? But narrative researchers do is just focus on the content. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Udi Samanhudi to give more explanations about narrative inquiry. So Dr. Udi Samanhudi, the screen is yours.
Right. Thank you very much, Ilmi, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming back and attending my second sessions of the narrative inquiry research. And last time, yesterday, we had discussions a lot about the basic of narrative inquiry, and then a little bit about ethics, and also some narrative data, which is focused on oral narrative. And this time, let me share screen first.
Oh yeah, excuse me, Dr. Udi.
Yes.
Everyone, the rule of the game is still the same, right? If you have any questions, you may
You're right.
interrupt.
You're right.
Any slides you may ask, right?
You're right. You're right. You're right. You're right. So I'm really expecting very active participation from the participants,
Sure.
like yesterday.
Sure.
All right. So
just like yesterday, right?
exactly. So just feel free to write down anything in the chat box, and then if you have questions while I'm, having my presentation, please do. You can interrupt and then ask me questions. All right. So the rule of the game will be exactly the same as what we did yesterday. Right. I'm trying to. Yeah, thank you very much, Ilmi. I'm trying to share screen. I don't know what happens. Am I the co-host already, Pak Nugraha? Okay, but yeah, I still cannot do the sharing.
Share screen, sir.
Yeah, I did. Let me check
yet. Not
Sorry,
yet.
not yet. So I'm waiting for it.
Okay.
Right. So yesterday we had like a discussions on the basic of narrative inquiry, and I have also explored the idea of positionality. Positionality is reference to the positions of narrative inquiry under the umbrella or the big umbrella of qualitative research. So I think you've got a lot of ideas about the position of inquiry within the qualitative research paradigm or approaches in general. And then yesterday we also talked a lot about oral narrative. Some example of oral narrative is, like the interview transcript that you produce from your interview, and then the narrative that you write from this interview. So that what we discussed yesterday, and let me do it again. Look, the same problem. Pak Nugraha, if you could help me.
Sir, on my way.
All right. Could you? Okay, sorry. I'm asking Pak Nugraha to come to my room. Let me stop the video first. Right, so I hope everyone now can see the slide. Okay, just to double check, can everyone see the slide? Yes.
Clearly, sir.
Okay, very clear. Okay, thank you very much, Nugra, for helping me. Right, so this is the focus of what we did and discussed yesterday, as I a little bit explored just now. We focused yesterday on the narrative inquiry as a form of qualitative research. And then I've really emphasized that when you are speaking about narrative inquiry, you are actually dealing with a qualitative research in general. And then the narrative data, we focus on oral narrative yesterday. And then I think I've also a little bit elaborated just now. And then ethical issues, which is sometimes still being ignored by a lot of researchers, especially from Indonesia. So to my observation, ethical issues sometimes are really beyond the considerations of the Indonesian researchers. So I'm trying to remind everyone here that when you are doing research, you have to really make sure that you fulfill the ethical issues, okay, before you are running the research process. So all these have been discussed yesterday. Now I'll give you some time to reflect on what you have got. Okay, so I will not ask you to write in a chat box, but I want you to think about what you really have got from our meeting yesterday. Okay, so I provide these 4 reflective questions for you to answer, okay, by yourself. And then you can express this by, like saying anything that you understand. Where you are now, you can just tell it to yourself, speak it aloud, okay? Or you can just write for a moment, for a minute, okay? So all these questions are purely reflective questions for you to answer and for yourself. There is not necessary for you to write down in the chat box, but I want you to think again about what you really have got from our previous session in session 1. So if you ask yourself, have I understood about the basic concept of narrative inquiry? So you know the answer, yes or no. If yes, what? If no, why? And what do I understand about oral narrative? So think about this, okay, in 1 or 2 minutes. Do you really get the point that I said to you yesterday? How could I ensure the trustworthiness issue in my future narrative research practice? So think again about this, question, this reflective question. This is purely for yourself, reflecting on your current knowledge about narrative inquiry. And how do I see ethics in conducting a narrative inquiry study? All right, so I give you like 1 to 2 minutes to think about these reflective questions. And after that, we move on to the next stage. All right. So I believe you've answered all the questions. Okay. I believe some of you express it loudly, saying it loudly. I mean the answers. Some of you maybe write the answers. Some of you maybe only think, in the mind you are trying to answer. You are busy answering all these reflective questions. But again, all the answers are for you and from yourself. This is just to check whether you have got really understood, really get a better understanding of the basic concept of narrative inquiry that we discussed yesterday. So the very main thing that I really want to highlight again from session 1 meeting yesterday, that is the central concerns of narrative inquiry. So something will be called as narrative inquiry when the data are in the form of stories or narrative. All right, so that's I think the main point, the focal point of narrative inquiry that we discussed yesterday. Okay. Any questions, queries, or comments before we continue to session 2? By the way, do you think there is question or queries or maybe comments from the participants before I start session 2 with new material about written narrative? No? Okay. So yes, session 2 will be focused on these 3 issues to further discuss. We'll be focusing our session today by discussing narrative data with a focus on written narrative. Yesterday we focused on oral narrative, and then today we focus on written narrative. So we'll try to see what type of written narrative can we use when we are doing narrative research, the types of written narrative that we can trying to understand and probably to do when we are doing a narrative research in the future. And then the second will be on data analysis and narrative inquiry, which I think very important for everyone here, because once you are doing a qualitative research, narrative inquiry, or whatever research you do, you will have to deal with the stage of data analysis. And then this is another stage that I think also very essential for everyone, that is evaluating and reporting narrative studies. So when we are speaking about evaluating and reporting narrative studies, I would elaborate on strategies to evaluate the quality of your narrative inquiry research, and then how you report your narrative inquiry studies. And to achieve all the 3 aims or purposes of the session, I'm still referring to the same book that I showed to you yesterday. I'm referring to the Narrative Inquiry in Language Teaching and Learning Research by Gary Barkhuizen and colleagues, and also Handbook of Narrative Inquiry, Mapping a Methodology by Jim Plantingan and colleagues. So I think if you are referring to these books for further observations about qualitative research in general and narrative inquiry in particular, then you will get more insights about narrative inquiry, and then probably get ideas on what to do and what to research under the heading of narrative inquiry. Now, we'll focus on written narrative. Any one of you can say something or probably guess what written narratives are? You may write in the chat box if you want to. Anyone can say something about written narrative? Oh, it's fictional. All right. So Rindu said it's fictional. Someone else maybe can guess or can just think about. All right, recount. Okay, based on experiences. Right. What else? Anything can say something about written narrative? Feel free. There is no right and wrong. We are doing a brainstorming activity before we move on to the next slide. So Rindu says it's fictional, Adolfina said it's recounting, and then Rindu also said it's based on experiences. Maybe someone else or anyone else could say something. Real life, all right. So written narrative is referring to what we can find in real life. Good. What else? Anyone else could share the ideas that you have in your mind? I think it's always a good idea to share with others when you have an idea, because that will help people to get to know what you have in the mind and then share. Okay, it's autobiography, right? Okay. Anyone else? Right. So Ahmad, Adolfina, Rindu, thank you very much for your contribution. Okay, so we'll continue to the next slide. Right. So there are contexts for you to get written narrative. And in the case of ELT or English language teaching context, this narrative or written narrative are mostly gained from, you know, settings like language classrooms. So you can get narrative data in the written narrative data from your class. If you are a teacher, then you can have a lot of data that you can gain, and this could be in the written form. I will tell you later on the types of written narrative. And the second one, you can get the narrative or the written narrative from professional development programs. If you are a teacher or a lecturer, so even students, you can, you know, join certain professional development programs. And then in this program, you will, you know, meet new people, you will meet new teachers, and then you have new experience of interacting with other teachers or other students. So this experience of interaction with your colleagues, teachers from other schools or lecturers from other campuses, build something new in your mind. And then this, you know, professional experience that you get from professional development programs with other colleagues, with other teachers, colleagues from other schools, for example, can be something that you can share in the written form. And that can be a written narrative or written data for you to analyze in a narrative inquiry approach or umbrella. And then the third one is the broader community beyond formal learning and teaching situations. Teachers, lecturers, students are part of the community. We live in society, and then sometimes we still bring our identity as a teacher. For example, I live in a, you know, in a housing, and my job or my profession is a lecturer, and sometimes I still bring with me the identity when I'm in the society, and I'm always put myself as a lecturer, and then I mix the experience of being a professional, a lecturer, with me as a member of community. So the interface between me as a lecturer and then me as part of the community brings something new, bring a new understanding about life in general that can, you know, be made as an interesting experience to tell how, for example, I locate myself as a lecturer in the community. How do I act as a lecturer within the community? How do I respond to differences of opinion from different professionals who live at the same community with me? So this kind of experience can also be brought into classroom as data and as, you know, something that we can focus on in our narrative research. So a lot of settings, a lot of context that we can made as places or settings whereby narrative or written narrative can be collected. So I hope you are not dizzy reading this. This is, a process of my learning of narrative research in a book, in an ebook that I read. I did this, you know, I put colors in order to get the point. So if you see, these are actually examples of context that I said to you, like language learners write about their learning experiences as participant research project. But in this case, they are not the primary researchers. These biographical accounts of their learning are often the product of a course activity or assignment, which are then analyzed by the researcher. So this is actually the written narrative that you can get from language learners or from pre-service and in-service language teachers. So these are actually example of things that relates to written narrative. Or you can also, get written data or written narrative from language teacher. They sometimes write about their teaching practice for professional development, usually for a course activity or assignment. So this kind of written narrative can also be collected and be part of your data to analyze in your narrative research, of course. All right, so this what we discussed before that Rindu and friends have written down in the chat box when I said, what do you know about written narrative? So when we are speaking about written narrative, we are speaking some examples of written data that can analyze in our narrative inquiry or narrative research. This narrative data could be in the form of learner diaries. So when we are, teaching English in a school or in a university level, of course, then we have students. Okay, we have learners, and then these students can be requested to write diaries. Okay, they put their learning activity in a diary, so they tell what activities they do during the day with you, for example, as the lecturer or as the teacher. You ask them to write whatever they feel, whatever they think they have learned, what they think they failed to understand, and so on. So all those things, all those kind of experiences are put together in learner diaries. And these learner diaries then could be one of many written narratives that we can collect and then analyze for our research narrative research activity. And these learner diaries, if you see, could be in many other forms or smaller types, like the autobiographical, the introspective documents that record the experiences of language learning from the learner's perspective. So these learner diaries tend to be very autobiographical because it's about them. So they write about their own experience as a learner or as a student. And language learning histories is another form of written narrative that you can collect. So language learning histories is a retrospective accounts of past learning. So it's like you are asking your students, for example, to track back to their experience in the past when they started learning English, for example. So this history of learning can be another example of written narrative data that you can collect from your student if your narrative inquiry or your narrative research involve students and focus on students. So for any question, comments, or ideas that you think is important to share? No? Okay, if not, then I will continue. Right, so another form of written narrative could be from the teacher side. It's not only the learner or the student who are asked to write their experiences in diary form. Sometimes teachers also, for professional development purpose, will need to write a teacher journal. So this teacher journals is all about the experiences of him or her as a teacher. So the experiences during teaching and learning process, the experiences during your interaction as a teacher with your students can be, some things that you can use as data. So you can write, or you can ask teachers to write journals, daily journals as a teacher, and then you can use this as one of many other data that you can analyze in your narrative inquiry or narrative research. And then teacher and learner narrative frames. This is another way of collecting data in the form of writing. You can ask teacher and learner to write something through frames that you provide. I will show you in the following slides. This frame will be very useful for teacher and learner in guiding them to write down what they have to write. Because sometimes people have experiences, a lot of experiences, but these people sometimes cannot really write down those experiences that they have. In the mind, they know that they have a lot of experiences. In the mind, they can speak. They know that they have those experiences, but sometimes it cannot be expressed for some reasons. So then a qualitative researcher, a narrative researcher especially, develop something called narrative frames in order to help the participants or the subject of our research to write their experiences by the guidelines and guidance that we provide in the frames. And here is the example. So for example, this is a very simple frame that we provide as a researcher. So we provide this frame in order to help our learner or teacher to really tell their experience. So we guide them through these questions. For example, we can ask them to, get back to their experience in the past time that there was like a difficult time as a teacher or as an English student. So then we can write a frame with a statement or a sentence like number 1. So I remember once in my classroom, I had a very difficult trying to. So we asked our student or teacher that join our narrative inquiry to freely write down the problem or the kind of difficulties that they encountered during, a certain period of time in the past. So we want them to again recall their experience, the difficulties of learning, for example, academic writing in English or speaking in English in the past time when they really started learning this language. And then you guide with this kind of, frames. And then you can also ask, for example, the main reason for this problem is that. So we really want to inquire more on the root of the problem or the cause of the difficulties. What is actually the main problem? We need to guide this, because sometimes, as I said, teachers have a lot of experiences. Students have a lot of problems and experiences, but sometimes they cannot express those experiences in the mind. So we help them by providing this frame in order that they have some kind of guideline and then just for free and freely write down what they think they had as an issue or a problem in the past time, and then what the problem was exactly, and then how he solved or she solved the problem. So this is an example of narrative frame that you can use to collect narrative data, especially in the written form. So this is, for me, this is like a very strategic and even smart choice, because sometimes when we just give a paper and let teachers and students that participate in our narrative research to write down their experiences, they get blank. So in order to avoid that kind of situations, then we provide this frame as a guideline and guidance. Okay, so this is another way of putting all those sentences that guide students or teachers in our narrative research. So we can put this way, okay, rather than like giving numbers like 1, 2, 3. You can put it like in a essay form, and then you ask them to freely write, to respond to all this in order to get information about the problem or the kinds of challenges that they face or encounter during their learning or teaching English in the classroom. Any ideas so far about the narrative frames or written narrative that I have explained? Any queries or questions or maybe comments about the written narrative as data in our narrative research? You may now write in the chat box any things that you think you have got until this stage of my presentation. Can anyone say something about the things that we've discussed about the written narrative, especially the use of this narrative frame? Because after this, I will ask you to respond to this narrative frame as a kind of practice for you to get data, to get experiences from your participants. Oh, okay. So Rindu asked, do we always use this frame? Not always. Not always. This frame is only for us to help, to help our participants to write down their experiences. Sometimes if it is really, useful and helpful, then you can choose to use this kind of frame. You develop this frame and then you ask your participants to write down their experiences based on the guidelines. But if you think your participants can just write freely, okay, with the instruction, for example, write down your experiences of learning language and they write the kind of essays, you can also do that kind of option. This is not a must. This is just a strategy for you to help your participants to find it easier to write down and, you know, to put in print what they have in the mind. So that's my response to your question, Mbak Rindu. Anyone else maybe could ask about this written narrative? So yeah, we will not, and you know, like always and always referring to this kind of frame. This is just an, you know, an example of potential strategy we can use when we find it difficult for getting our participants to write their experiences. Right, thank you very much, Mbak Rindu. And now we move on to the next stage of this session. So what I want you to do now is to again get back to an example of frame number one that I showed to you, and then we discussed just now. I want you to try to respond to this, get back to your memory, to your past time, your experience of learning English, for example, the kind of problems that you encountered, and then what was actually the problem, and then how did you solve it? All right. So if you could think in 5 minutes to respond to this 7 or 4 or 5 of these 7 questions, that we find. Think again about your own experience, refer back to your experience, and respond to question number 1, respond to question number 2, number 3, number 4. If you want to stop there, you can stop. Okay, so feel free now to reflect on your own experience of learning English by responding this frame. So I give you 3 to 5 minutes to think. And if you could write in the chat box, that would be lovely. If you could only reflect on your own and for yourself, that would be no problem at all for me. But if you could write in the chat box, that would be lovely. All right, so in 5 minutes.
Okay, so everyone, you have 3 to 5 minutes.
Oh, Ilmi, you are back?
Hello, so sorry.
No way, you left us.
No, I'm listening to you, but I cannot respond.
All right, okay. So I think without you, the participants would just okay. You need to guide them.
Yeah.
Right. So if you could help to remind again the participants with this activity, that would be lovely.
Okay, so everyone, could you please respond to questions 1 to 7? Do they have to respond to all the questions?
No. It's just optional. They can only respond number 1 or number 2 or only 3 of them. That should be no problem. Just to give a sense of experience in feeling in this kind of narrative frames that may be useful when they do narrative research in the future.
Okay, so you can pick questions from 1 to 7, which one that may suit you, and then please type it in the chat box, your response, right?
Yeah. So if you can answer all, this can actually form a kind of story, So that's why this frame is created, because this really is intended to create or to elicit experiences that we can produce as a story. Yeah, feel free to respond.
Feel free to respond. I remember when you write.
Right, so maybe we can also invite if I mean, anyone who want to, like respond to this orally, you can turn on your camera and then say something to respond to this. Tell your experience about your challenges in learning language, in learning English, for example, okay, based on the guideline and guidance of this frame.
Yeah, I think it's better to start from the number one, right?
Mhm.
For example, I remember once in my classroom, I had a very difficult time trying to understand all the information, all the knowledge that the lecturer gave to me in
Mhm.
a long time. I mean, like in 2 hours, for example.
Mhm. And the main
Because
reason for that problem was that what?
yeah, maybe I cannot fully concentrate. I couldn't fully
Alright.
concentrate in 2 hours, and then because yeah, it's
Okay.
like that.
Okay. And how did you solve the problem at the time?
Um, I sometimes, not sometimes, I try to solve the problem by refocusing myself. I mean, like, take a break for or 20 seconds or 30 seconds, and then, okay, try to concentrate again to the lecturer.
Okay, that's very good.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe you can invite participants to do
Yeah,
like
okay.
what you did
So
just now. That's a very good
everyone,
example on how to respond to
it's
this
just an
frame.
example.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Pak Ilmi, can I?
Yes, please.
Yes, please,
Tuan
Okay.
Alvina.
Yeah.
Adolfina.
Thank you. Okay. This is my experience when I was at senior high school. I remember once in my classroom, I had a very difficult time trying to demonstrate an instruction as a pilot flying a plane. The main reason for this
All
problem was
right.
that I had no experience. I haven't or I never seen a pilot flying a plane. So I don't know how to fly the plane. So
Right.
it was imaginary. So how
Okay.
to what demonstrate, make it what the instruction of in the classroom
Right.
we do we did a demonstration. Yeah, that was a problem, a big problem
Right.
for me. Then
Because you had no background at all.
yes,
Okay.
yeah, I
Right.
have no schemata about that.
Exactly.
Yeah,
That's good, Chad.
yeah.
And then what did you do to solve that problem at the
Well,
time,
I
if you
just
could
keep
remember?
quiet, and the teacher showed how to fly the plane, and I was shocked. I want to say something, but I was afraid because at the time the teacher was a foreigner, so we had a foreigner teacher, an English teacher from the Great Britain. So that's why I'm afraid. I was afraid to say something that I don't know how to fly a plane. That's what make me shy, something like that. Yeah, in
So
front of the friend.
right. So it would be very helpful if
Yeah. Yeah, it would have been very helpful if the teachers show it or maybe before that he gave us a kind of picture of a video how a pilot flying a plane. So
right.
that's yeah.
So you need some kind of schemata, okay,
Yes.
before you then were asked by the teacher to do, to draw something or to make something about plane with a pilot flying.
That's true.
Okay.
That's true.
All right. So, okay, that's very
Thank
interesting.
you.
That's very interesting. Very good, Radovina. Great. Anyone else would like to try? This is just to give you an experience of how you respond a narrative frame that maybe a narrative researcher provide for you, or you as a narrative researcher would like to develop in the future. Because sometimes, as I said, it's very difficult to invite our participants to write down the whole experiences of, for example, their learning journey of a foreign language like English, then we have no option. We have to guide them. And then this kind of narrative frame could be developed by us as a researcher in order to help our participants to elicit their problems in, in the written form like this. All right. Or you can make it like oral data. You can just read this sentence, and then they respond, and then you record, and then you build the narrative yourself based on the recording. So a lot of strategies in order to get data from our participants, and this narrative frame is one of those strategies for us as a narrative researchers to get the written data from the participants, simply because in the real in a real context or in reality, sometimes it's hard to get the narrative from our participants. And this is the way for us as a researcher to elicit those experiences.
Yeah,
Anyone
that's
else?
right.
Anyone
Dr.
else
Udi,
would like to share?
There's a
Maybe.
response, sorry, Mr. Ilmi, in the chat
Yeah.
box from Haika.
Yeah, right. I think this narrative frame elicitation method will be very helpful to the participants whose problem is like what Haikal has. This one, Haikal says, when I'm learning English, the main problem that I face is about speaking. That I'm too nervous to utterance. So I think this narrative frame will be very helpful because he has a problem with the lacking of confidence speaking in English, right? So I just silence, right? So he remains silent in front of them, and then how did he try to solve the problem? He tried to solve the problem by speaking a lot, practicing a lot in the bathroom a lot, right? Yeah, I think.
Right.
But if we use it oral narrative frame, I think he cannot express narrative story like this one. Am I right?
Right. So there is always like plus and minuses. What is important for a narrative researcher is that to be very sensitive with the situation. We need to always be ready for any unexpected situation. Like, for example, we come to participants and they cannot give any data because they are just too shy to say something, even in Bahasa Indonesia, to tell or to recount their experiences of learning English. So this kind of frame then will be very useful, as I said. So this is just to give you an experience of dealing with a narrative frame, and just to give you an option to help participants to elicit their experiences. Okay, so there are many other ways, I believe, but this is just one of the many examples that you can use in order to elicit data from your participants. Okay, any more response for this?
Not yet.
Shall I continue?
You can continue.
Right. Okay. Okay. So another very essential things to be to be put in our mind is about data analysis and narrative inquiry. I believe that there are a lot of questions regarding data analysis in narrative inquiry, on whether or not, for example, this data analysis in narrative inquiry the same or similar to those data analysis in qualitative research in general, like case study or phenomenology or even content analysis, for example. So we will see what kind of data analysis in narrative inquiry, but in general, to tell you in the beginning, data analysis in narrative inquiry, because this is another form of qualitative research, is almost similar to those any kind of qualitative studies. Take a look at this and please read. Because narrative inquiry is a form of qualitative research, narrative studies often employ the same approaches to data analysis that are used in other types of qualitative research. So this is not that are used in other types of qualitative research. So in qualitative research, for example, you have probably like thematic analysis. We'll see in another slide. Do we have this in narrative inquiry? I believe yes. Let's see. So the narrative research would, employ data both in the form of narrative and non-narrative data. Last time in our session 1, we talked about the narrative analysis and analysis of narrative, which look similar but actually different. Narrative analysis, if you can recall your memory, your remembrance about what we discussed yesterday, narrative analysis is that the analysis that are focused on the constructions of the narrative itself. The data could be from the interview that we transcribe and then we put into narrative form. Well, the analysis of narrative, if you could get back to what you have learned yesterday, was focused on the existing narrative data. Could be written, could be spoken data, and then you focus on the content, on the organizations of this narrative data. So the kind of data referring to those two approaches in analyzing the kinds of data in narrative research, then would give impact to the kind of data that we analyze. So we have, of course, as we said, and as we discussed yesterday, narrative. So when we speak about narrative data, means that the data have already in the form of stories. Okay, so the stories are there. We just need to analyze this existing narrative data. For example, published language and learning memoirs, elicited language learning histories, or completed narrative frames. So all these are examples of narrative data, the data that have been in the form of narrative. And what we can do is that to analyze all this. What I mean by all this is that these are the data that are very potential as sources of data that we can analyze. So we can, for example, just focus on one of these. Our study, for example, focus on analyzing the published language and learning memoirs of a certain successful language learner. So we can focus on this, and that can be a case of narrative research. Okay, or we can combine analyzing narrative like published language and learning memoirs and elicited language learning histories from the same person, a successful learner, a successful teacher of English, for example. So the memoirs could be, data that we can analyze, and that can produce a narrative research study. But there is also another non-narrative data that we can use in our narrative research. What is non-narrative data? As I have illustrated in my elaborations about narrative analysis and analysis of narrative, non-narrative data refer to those which are not in the form of stories. So they are not in the story form yet. For example, the interview transcript. I interview Ilmi and I ask Pak Ilmi about his experiences as a student of English when, for example, he did his undergraduate degree in Universitas Pajajaran, if I'm not mistaken. So Ilmi then could be my participant, my sole and single participants, and then I interview him. So when I interview Ilmi about his experience of learning English in Unpad, for example, then I could produce with me an interview transcript. And of course, this interview transcript is not in the form of story yet. What I need to do is that to construct or to put this in a narrative text. What I mean by narrative text is that we construct stories from the transcript that I produced from my interview with Pak Ilmi. All right. So another thing is like diaries of reflective journals and multimodal texts. So what we mean by multimodal text is that series of texts that, that have multiple forms. So the text is not only spoken text, written text, pictures are also text. So we can narrate something, we can create a narrative from a picture, for example. If you see, for example, a photo of a student, and then this student looks so gloomy while learning in the classroom, then you can build a narrative. You can tell something from the photo, or from the, you know, from the figure, or from the image, or whatever. So this kind of text is actually, you know, a means or a medium for you to construct something called as narrative, and this narrative then become your data to further analyze. Okay, so do you get points that I say in the slide?
Yeah, okay, but Udi, I have a question.
Oh, yes, please. Yes, please, Udina.
So when we, let's say, transform the data into a narrative form, so it means we have to follow the generic structure of narrative text.
Well, that's very good question. It's always good idea to understand the nature of narrative itself. Yes, you are right. When we are building a narrative, means that we are following, not always like exactly like what a narrative text that we learn in school's level. You know, what we mean by narrative here is that when you have in that text the character, when you have in the text the experience of the character, when you have in the text the time when that, you know, that happening happens or occur. So this kind of thing that, you know, the magic example that I showed to you, a non-native English teacher in Hungary that we discussed yesterday, is a simple narrative that we can refer on how she built a narrative from her own experience. And that kind of simple narrative could also be followed when we learn to try to build narrative from an interview transcript. So that's what we mean by narrative here. It's not like exactly the same as narrative text that we learn in schools level, because it looks so complicated. You can just ensure that as long as there is the character, as long as there is an event, as long as there is a time that show whether it happens in the past time or today, things like that are there in your narrative, that should be called as quote unquote narrative. Yeah. Thank you, Bu Dina. Is there anyone else would like to respond to this issue of narrative and non-narrative data? The things to highlight is that when you are speaking about narrative research, please bear in mind that the data could be in the form of narrative or even non-narrative data. But for this non-narrative data, that will be useful for you to construct them into narrative form phase in order you know, for you, in order to help you to find it much easier to analyze the data. Because this is narrative research, you have to really construct the narrative in order to analyze further for your study purpose. Okay, any more response or question?
Yep, anyone would like to add or pose a questions? Feel free.
Right, okay. I think there is no more response and questions, so I will continue to the next slide. Right, so in analyzing narrative data, as I said, thematic analysis is also there. Because this is qualitative research. This is because narrative research is part of or another form of qualitative research. Thematic analysis is an analysis form that we can apply or we can use in our process of data analysis in our narrative research study. So when we are speaking thematic analysis, this is something that we all have been very, very familiar, I believe. For example, when you are doing a thematic analysis, you will need to really get the theme. Okay, so what you will frequently or mostly or normally do, that would be things like repeated reading of the data. Because if you only read once and then you say, oh, the theme is A and B and C, maybe you are wrong. Maybe it is correct, but it's actually not. All right, so repeated reading is always important in thematic analysis. And then after repeated reading, there is coding and categorizations of data extracts. So you put coding and you put category of data extracts. And where this coding is coming from, you can do the bottom up way or the top down. By saying bottom up, the coding is coming, or the categorization is coming from the data itself. So what the data says and what kind of category emerge from the data. Okay, so that's what we mean by bottom up. But sometimes we use theory. So the coding that you use is produced by someone else, the theorist, or the other researchers, previous researchers. So when you are, for example, interested in motivation of learning English, as I said, as I said last time in session 1, and I put as an example, then you might referring to, the theory of motivation, and then there are, categories of motivation, for example, and then you are referring to that theory in your process of data analysis. Okay, and their reorganization under thematic headings. So I think this would be really essential for you to understand, again, to underline that narrative research is another form of qualitative research, which means that the data analysis in qualitative research in general is mostly and frequently and even normally is also used by narrative researchers. So in published narrative studies, major themes are typically discussed in separate sections of the report, where they are broken down into sub-themes and illustrated by extract from narratives. I will show you my current work on narrative inquiry, in which I use the thematic analysis, and then I put themes in a separated, paragraph, and then some subheadings that I developed from not from the data, but that I took from the theory of identity construction of learner of English and teacher of English. I'll show you in my later presentation. And sometimes when you are analyzing the discourse, or you are analyzing the narrative as a discourse, you are also, as a narrative researcher, focusing on something else, not only like the message that you get from the narrative. Sometimes you focus on small things, though this is not quite common in narrative research in general that I observed so far, but it is still very possible for us to do narrative research on this issue. For example, your narrative study could be focused on the identifications and interpretation of metaphors. What does that mean? Why the student that you asked to participate in your study in his or her narrative produce metaphors? Why these metaphors are used? Okay, so you can focus on that. It's like doing content analysis, but your focus is a little bit different. Okay, you are trying to understand why these metaphors are used by the participant for what purpose. So you are trying to better understand a phenomenon in a qualitative research. So you are trying why your participant, the student that joined your research, when he or she built or write his or her narrative of his experience of learning English, for example, put more metaphors for what. So you can focus on that kind of thing in your narrative research. Paying attention to structural features of narrative in interaction. Small stories, you can also focus on the small stories, for example, the result of your conversation with your student that participate in your research. That could also be the focus of your narrative research. So narrative research is not always about something big, like big stories like what I explained to you yesterday, the life history. You can focus on small thing, small event that what I did and I report in my narrative research that I displayed in session 1 yesterday about my experience as an international student in one foreign university in the UK. So that's single, experience that happened in the past time, which was a very small part of my study. A small story could also be the focus of my narrative research. And this is another strategy of doing data analysis in narrative research. So you can even do narrative writing as a way to analyze your narrative. It might be confusing. So if you can read in narrative analysis, narrative itself becomes an analytical tool that is brought to bear through narrative writing. So the outcome includes historical accounts, case studies, or storied episode of people's life. So you will see if you Google or if you try to find out journals that publish narrative studies, there are a lot of narrative work that are presented in a narrative way. So in the discussion part, they, report the findings in a narrative way. And this narrative strategy is actually part of the analysis itself. So building the narrative, writing the data analysis result in the narrative form is actually something that is common in narrative research. So your narrative writing is your narrative data analysis. I can show you an example of this, whereby the narrative is put in the discussion part, and this narrative is actually a result of the data analysis. I hope you get confused and then you ask the question.
Yeah, anyone, please. It's a bit confusing, actually, right?
Yes. I know it's confusing, but once you do it, you will really understand. So the narrative writing means you write the narrative, and that writing process, that narrative writing process is actually part of your data analysis.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe people here can respond to this, or maybe can help me to make it clear for other, participants.
So what you are trying to explain is we as a narrative researcher, right? When we do the narrative writing analysis, we also construct our narrative.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Right. So when you can imagine when you are writing a narrative from your transcript, from your interview transcript, you will put your interpretation there. Okay, you do not simply describe, but you put your interpretation. Because you put your interpretations, then you are basically doing a narrative analysis. You are trying to make meaning.
The narrative,
right? You are trying to make meaning of what you learn from the transcript. You build stories, and then when you are, or while you are, building that narrative, you are making your own claims, you are interpreting the story that you create. So all is there, and that's what we call as narrative analysis process or strategy. Yeah, I see Rindu raise a hand, yes. Rindu, please.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's, yes, very confusing.
I know.
Yeah, I think I've actually done such a narrative writing analysis, but I sort of did not realize that it's actually narrative writing analysis. Maybe, but I don't know. Maybe after you present this, and then I said to myself, oh, so what I've done so far is a kind of narrative writing analysis, but maybe in different term, or maybe I just don't understand yet. But I have a question in analyzing the data. Sometimes in my paper, I put the term in analyzing the data, the researcher used this technique, for example, use blah blah blah, use the technique of blah 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 blah. So what is the technique for analyzing the data in narrative inquiry? Is it similar to like we have content analysis, for example, and we have the descriptive qualitative analysis for analyzing the data? So are they all similar to that descriptive or content analysis in presenting the data analysis, or is there any specific differences among them? Thank you.
Okay, that's very good. That's very good. That's very good. Okay, so when we talk again the umbrella of qualitative research design or qualitative research approaches, I always mention and re-mention that the analysis of data in narrative inquiry would potentially similar or even the same as other qualitative research. For example, a lot of qualitative research employ thematic analysis, okay? So when they analyze the data, they said they are doing thematic analysis because they are trying to find out or to build themes from the data. So the stories or the narrative that we analyze can also referring to the principles of thematic analysis, which is very common in qualitative research. We can repeat reading the stories or the narrative. We can give coding, we can categorize them. This is exactly the same as what we do to data in other qualitative forms. You can also do almost similar thing for content analysis. You can say you do content analysis in your narrative inquiry. Why? Because you focus on small elements of the text. For example, in the word level, the metaphors level, the phrase, or so all those things is really possible to be in your narrative inquiry, because in fact, this is a qualitative research. All right, but what is interesting is actually this one, right? This is what is unique, what is not found in other qualitative research. We do data analysis by writing it narratively. Okay, for example, as I said, we are converting the interview transcript into narrative. So the process of writing this narrative, constructing this narrative from transcript of interview, for example, is considered as a strategy of data analysis or data analysis itself in narrative inquiry. So you can claim, you can say that your data analysis is following the principle of narrative writing analysis, in which the researcher put comments or the researcher built, interpretation of the stories or during the process of writing the narrative. So what makes this unique? Because this narrative writing analysis is rarely found and practiced by qualitative researchers in other form like content analysis or descriptive or exploratory studies. Okay?
Thank you for insightful.
Yeah. No worries. Thank you very much. Is there any response or maybe question? Because I know this is, when I read this, it's really confused me. But then I became really understand when I finally practice it. When I practice it, then I was aware that yes, during the process of narrative writing, why it is called as narrative writing analysis, because I put a lot of interpretations during narrative writing, during converting interview transcripts into narrative. So then, all right, I understand. That's what I said to myself, okay? Because you're right, first encountering this issue, we will be so confused. But once we did it, once we do it in the future, we will understand it.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how many times did you read the text until you understand it?
Me, many times. I'm a slow learner, to be honest. But I'm just very patient, to learn. I know that I'm a slow learner, so I read more and more.
I'm also wondering about the process, Pak Udi,
Yes,
the
yes.
process of analyzing the data. So at the same time, for example, we are looking for themes in the data, but at the same time we also write the narrative. For example, the interview data. For example, I asked a teacher about questions regarding teacher's competence, and then the teachers responded, "Oh, the required competence of a teacher is A, blah 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 blah," and then and then I put the thematics. Oh, so she or he considered that the competence required from the teacher is. I found the themes. For example, pedagogic competence, and then this is emotional competence, and then social competence. From those findings, and then I make a narrative from the themes that I got. Is that correct?
Right. Yes. You can make in two ways like that, of course. So there is, remember, because this is a narrative research, what makes it different is that we sometimes put it in a narrative way. So after put the theme, then we build in the discussion part, for example, the narrative. So by doing that, you are actually combining the two data analysis, the thematic and the narrative writing analysis. However, please put in mind that sometimes we just need to tell the audience or readers that we stick to one that is more dominant than the other one. So if you think it is fine for you to say that during the data analysis, you focus and you employ more thematic analysis, just mention that it is a thematic analysis. But if you want to, enrich your methodology part by saying that you combine both narrative data analysis and then thematic analysis, that also would be fine. But what is important in narrative analysis, in your finding and in your discussion part, your tag should be in a narrative form. Okay, because this narrative inquiry could be presented, you still remember, paradigmatically and narratively. Paradigmatically means you just write a paper, a normal paper, but it is an inquiry research. But the paper is written like, a general research report or research papers that we, mostly write or normally write. But in doing narrative analysis as your part of data analysis, your data presentation, your discussion should be written in narrative way. Okay, because that shows the product of your narrative analysis. Okay, so I think your exposure to examples of narrative research papers would give you more pictures on the kind of narrative research presentation. And this narrative research presentation or papers, how they are written, sometimes represent on how the data are analyzed. Yeah. Yeah. Is there any more?
Okay, anyone?
Yeah.
Feel free to ask. You can type in the chat box, or you can simply raise your hand or open up your mic.
Okay, if no, then I will continue to the next.
Yet.
Yeah, to the next slide. This is exactly what I have also mentioned, that sometimes we can focus on something small within the text when we analyze a narrative discourse. We can focus on the metaphors, the narrative structure, the narrative in interaction. Just to remind you again that a narrative text could also be analyzed from the perspective of content analysis by focusing on the small part of it, the small things from the word level until, metaphors or phrase or even terms level. Okay, now to the issue of trustworthiness in narrative inquiry. Yesterday we also a little bit, discussed the issue of trustworthiness in narrative inquiry. And what I want to show now is again something related to how we be more responsible with our narrative research, because the question regarding trustworthiness would always and always be an issue in narrative research or narrative inquiry in general. So getting back to the issue of the fact that narrative research or narrative inquiry is part of the qualitative research, the criteria of credibility, transferability, confirmability are also applicable in narrative inquiry. So you can build the trustworthiness of your narrative inquiry by focusing on these three and by doing some kind of techniques that we put here that is, proposed by Lincoln and Buba. For example, if you have a prolonged engagement with your participant, if you do it in a long time, for example, 1 year or say 1 semester. So you are actually at the same time building credibility of your study, and you try to ensure the trustworthiness because you build a prolonged engagement. So then more data and more, engagement between you and participants, so that you know your participants very well. So you can understand the story, and the stories that you build, that you get from the, sharing with your participant is something that really represent their experiences, for example. So this kind of techniques could be used as a strategy to build and to ensure the trustworthiness of your inquiry or narrative research. Persistent observations is another technique. You can combine between, prolonged and persistent observation. You can also put number 3, triangulation through sources, methods, and investigators, or you can do the 7, but I think that's too many. We can choose, certain techniques combining, 1, 2, or 3 of them to ensure the credibility, which again contributes to, to ensure the trustworthiness issue in your research. So in responding to the issue of trustworthiness, you can again get back to what most qualitative researchers do in order to ensure the trustworthiness of their studies. What I want to underline is that please refer to qualitative research in general, okay, when you are speaking about trustworthiness in your narrative inquiry, because this is still applicable. Okay. Right. So what I want to say about this is actually to show you a paper that you can refer. So it is called Enquiry into Narrative Trustworthiness and so on. So if you could Google this, find this, and read this paper, then you will understand issues regarding trustworthiness in narrative inquiry. So what I want to highlight again, if you confuse with the issue of trustworthiness, okay, in your paper, again, you can get back to the trustworthiness concept on qualitative research in general, because that is still applicable. So the thing that Lincoln and Guba have proposed regarding trustworthiness building and qualitative research in general is really, really applicable in your narrative inquiry. Okay, so just choose 1 or 2 techniques, including the transferability you do, for example, thick description, in order to ensure the transferability and then to ensure the trustworthiness in general. So you can get back to this in order to write something about trustworthiness issue in the methodology part of your narrative research papers. Okay, again, Jason Law from National Institute of Education. I think this paper is really good for you to refer when you are speaking about trustworthiness issue in narrative inquiry. So I really, really encourage you to go to at least Google Scholar and find this and then load and read. Okay, there are a lot of variation to ensure trustworthiness in narrative inquiry, but just to make it simple, I refer you to the issue of trustworthiness in qualitative research in general. Okay, question, please.
Yep. we welcome questions or comments from the participants.
Any question, comments, feel free. Or if you are bored already, you can go somewhere and then drink coffee. You can take a deep breath. I know 2 hours is a very long time to study for something that maybe you already know actually, or for something that is new to you. I know it's quite tiring. So relax, take some time to take a breath, a deep breath, or drink fresh water, or do whatever you like.
Yeah.
5 to 2 minutes, and then get back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
After
ladies
this,
and
we'll
gentlemen.
still have issue related to evaluating your research paper. Your narrative inquiry, and then the reporting your narrative research or narrative inquiry studies.
Yeah, because today's topic, it's getting more profound, right, about narrative inquiry. Okay, so the topic gets deeper and deeper until now we are discussing about how to analyze the narrative inquiry data, right? Maybe, right, if there's no questions,
If there is no, then I will continue.
Okay, I'm just wondering, right? If you said that we can go top-down processing and also bottom-up processing, right? The data.
Sorry,
when we
I
process the
cannot
data.
catch your.
Okay.
Can you say it again?
Can you hear me? You said that when we analyze the narrative data, we can go top down or we can go bottom up, right?
Yes, right. For the coding and
Right. So
categorization.
yeah, if we categorization, if we go with top down data processing, meaning that we got the theme from the external, right? So from other researchers and then the previous studies and so on. So if we start from a top-down data processing, meaning that we try to design the written frame, right? The written frame data. Okay, we design it specifically just to match with the theme.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Again, this is qualitative research, which means that when we have the frame to follow for thematic analysis, when we are referring to existing categories, for example, in the area of motivation, that is fine. But what is expected is that the data that we have could produce another unique category. So if we could contribute to the knowledge, by having like one additional category that we get from data, that emerge from data, I think that's where the innovation is. So that is why sometimes senior researchers always expect us to start from data rather than from the theory when we are doing qualitative research, or in particular when we are doing narrative research, because we want to get a new variations of category in the fields of motivation of learning English, for example. But then if our data only, represent all those categories existing in the theories, that will be okay. But what is actually expected, because we do research and we want to contribute to the knowledge development in the field, then we are expected to get from the data something new that's purely and genuinely emerge from the data. That is why option like to do the coding and categorization bottom up or top down, that's actually related to that thing, that is our contributions to knowledge through new category, probably coming from the data that emerged from our data.
So which one would you suggest for our as a narrative
for a
researcher?
I think for a beginner, it is always good to have the existing categories, because
Existing categories.
that is really useful. But remember, although you have the existing categories from theories that you refer, there is always a possibility that you still get another category that purely, genuinely coming from or emerging from the data. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So guys, right, you start from existing categories, right? Yeah. Existing categories. Don't start from the scratch, okay?
Yeah.
Because it's harder, of course. It's more difficult.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. So
okay.
No
right.
more question, then I'll continue.
No more questions, comment. You can continue.
30 minutes to finish. Okay, this is more practical rather than theoretical. This is 5 helpful questions in determining your narrative type of study. So these 5 questions will help to lead you to, to determine your narrative type of study. Okay, so question number 1 is, who writes or records the story? This individual is a basic distinctions of the research. Writing and recording the experiences of another is a biography. Okay, remember, when the individual who is writing is the subject of the study, is an autobiography. So you can choose whether you want to do a biographical study or an autobiographical study. That depends on who the participant is. Okay. The work that I shared to you yesterday about my experience was called an autoethnography. Why I said autoethnography, not autobiography? Because I put the culture of education in Indonesian context. The difference between autobiography and autoethnography, like what I did, was in the aspect of culture. When you write autobiography, you don't need to think about a certain culture that is reflected in your narrative. But for me, because I choose autoethnography, I have a responsibility to show that there is a certain culture that impact on me. So the culture that I mean in my paper was the culture of education that didn't provide me with, the education of critical thinking or critical pedagogy. So that is also called as the culture of educations that has really, affected my knowledge and skills in writing academic English. Okay, so that is autoethnography. But in autobiography, you just simply write your experience without thinking too much about which culture that really impact on your learning journey or teaching journey as a teacher. All right, so who writes or records the story, that would help to lead what kind of narrative study that you will do. Okay. So how much of life is recorded and presented? So this question will also lead you to what kind of narrative research that we will focus on. So this is a distinction among narrative studies. Writing about an individual entire life is something done by anthropologists. So if you focus on the life history, it will take time, okay? And this mostly conducted by an anthropology. So if you are a teacher or student who really wants to learn about narrative research, I would not recommend a life history study because that will take a longer time. In education, narrative studies usually are not about an entire life. They focus on a single event or episode in an individual's life. Getting back to my experience and the paper that I said to you, that's again a single experience of my life in a certain period of time during my doctoral journey. So that is what we recommend in the area of education or when we want to do a narrative research, because if we focus on a life history, that would be too long. It takes time, and this mostly conducted by anthropologists. And who provide the story? Okay, you can identify the type of narrative by closely examining who provides the story. This is very relevant to education. So examples are teacher stories, personal accounts of their classroom experience. So because we are in the fields of education, so the data that we will collect would be in the form of, for example, teacher stories. We will not focus on the entire life of somebody, a figure, for example, because we are not an anthropologist. We have some time constraint and limitation. So then this is a narrative area is focused mostly on teachers' voices, teachers' identity construction, student identity construction, and so on, because we still can do that in a certain period of time that we think we still can do, do that in a shorter time frame. Is a theoretical lens being used? This is very good question. I think number 4. Is a theoretical lens being used? A theoretical lens in narrative research is a guiding perspective or ideology that provides structure for advocating for groups of individuals in the written report. The researcher provides a voice for the individual who is seldom heard in educational research. So still, a theoretical lens is really important in order to guide us during the process of study. But again, when we find something new, like a new category in our data, then that is what we actually really expect. But still, theories are important as a guideline. And can narrative forms be combined? Of course, yes. Okay, so we can do both. For example, narrative research analyzing both autobiography and biography. This is what I will show to you in my current work that I have just sent to a journal and which is still under review. I'm combining my autobiography and my student biography. So we can combine, we can analyze the 2 stories in our narrative research. Okay. I'm a little bit lost with this.
I think that was yesterday.
Yeah. Yes, you're right. So these are examples of actually combining some resources or some data to analyze. For example, if you see here, he analyze more than 1 data sources from the memoirs and then from the autobiography of the participants. So this is exactly the same as what I do actually. And this person also, Robert O. McCain, is also developing more than 1 kind of narrative. So he is combining different sources of narrative to analyze. This is what I do. This is my current project that I have submitted to to TESOL quarterly and under review. So I'm combining 2 different stories. One is from my own and the other one is from my student. So if I mention this name, Noy is actually my student who is now my colleague here in this office. So I focus on his life story as a student, and then it is his biography. Okay, he didn't write it by himself. He just tell me. If he wrote it by himself, it's become an autobiography because he wrote it by himself. What I did was eliciting the data from him, his experiences through interview. So I then transcribed the interview and then put it in a narrative. Okay, that then I analyze further. And then I also put my own autobiography here. Why I say autobiography? Because I tell my own stories, my life experiences as a student before and as a teacher now. So I combine these 2 narratives and analyze them and put them in my narrative study. The title is, Now I Have Firmly Decided to Be an English Teacher in the Future, a narrative of an EFL student teacher from an, sorry Nugraha, from an economically disadvantaged background in Banten province, Indonesia. Nugraha is Noy here, and he is now my colleague in this office. Right, so this is just an example that I showed to you in response to a question on whether or not we combine narrative, whether or not combining narrative is possible in our narrative research. So the answer is very possible. We can combine both autobiography data and biography data in our narrative research. And if you Google, you can find out this actually. Okay, so these are steps that you could apply when you think of doing a narrative research or narrative study in the future. You can do step number one, of course. You start by the identifications of a phenomenon to explore. Like what I'm interested in more is actually on the issue of identity construction as a teacher of English and as a learner of English. So my phenomenon, okay, would be really related to identity construction as a teacher, for example. So think about what phenomenon to identify, what kind of topic that you are really interested in, okay, in your narrative research in the future. Think a topic that you think you are really have interest on it, and then do it. And then think about selecting your participant. Who? Because I'm really interested in the struggling issue of an English student. So I chose a student from law economy background. So I chose one of my student because he told me he was from law economy background family. So this is very interesting because there are a lot of values that I can share by interviewing him and then put his experiences into my narrative research. Then collect stories, of course, from the individuals that join or that participate in your study. Okay, you can have them tell their story, collect other field text. So these are all steps that you can find out actually in Google and then learn. But the issue is that when you are trying to do a narrative research, please think about a topic that you think you would really have interest on it, and something that will not make you bored during the process of doing your narrative research, because that's very important in order to keep your motivation up and high. Okay, this is something that I have explored just now, the step from here. So I think I will not talk more on these slides because I have already explored them. What is interesting now to focus on is how you report your narrative studies, because in the literature or in Google Scholars or in the papers or even thesis or dissertations that use narrative inquiry approaches in their study, a lot of types or forms or format of reporting these narrative studies. What I want to highlight now is that before I speak about all this, what I want to say here to open this reporting narrative studies is that there is no single format to follow, which means that there is no one single strict rule of reporting your narrative studies. There are a lot of examples, narrative papers that you can Google and you can find out. And if you see them, there is no one single rule saying that to report a narrative study, you have to follow format X. None. There is a lot of variation that you can create. You can create your own depending on the kind of narrative that you work on and the kind of the kind of narrative study that you are doing or you are developing. So there is no one fixed format, which means that it depends on your creativity in reporting your narrative study. But if we follow the conventional way, especially in education field or the social science research approach and reporting, this is the typical layout or the typical format that most researchers in our fields follow. Is this wrong to follow this kind of convention in narrative inquiry report? Of course, no. You still can make this as an option, okay, when you are reporting your narrative study or when you are writing a narrative papers. You can start with developing the topic of the study and the relevant research question. Usually you will put it in introduction, followed by literature review, followed by methodology, finding and discussion, or only findings, and then after that discussion and conclusion. So this is just a conventional way that you can follow if you want to, but if you think this is not interesting to present or to report your narrative research, then you don't need to follow this. But in the literature, if you see this is something that is still followed by some researchers in the fields of narrative inquiry. And if you see, this is an example from a dissertation that employ narrative inquiry as the approach used by the researcher. So this is quite a little bit conventional, okay, if you see. So it's the title, the abstract, the introduction, literature review, and then some theories, and then method, participant data gathering, online course. If you see, this is quite conventional. And if you ask, is this wrong? Of course not. This is not wrong at all. You still can do and follow this kind of convention or format in reporting your narrative research. But if you want to, create your own format based on the uniqueness of your study, based on the themes that you found in your study, that is 100% okay and fine. You can do that. And if you see, for example, the organizations of finding sections in narrative inquiry, this is also very typical. When you do a thematic analysis, then you will have a theme, like theme 1, and then you discuss it, you put the extract of data, you discuss it, and then put the example from data, and then you discuss it. So this, again, about the creativity of us as the narrative researchers in presenting the data or in reporting our research in general. Okay, so the thing that I want to, again, emphasize when I'm speaking about this is that there is no single rule saying that you have to follow a certain fixed format in reporting your narrative studies. Well, the issue of trustworthiness is important, but this is like an evaluation of the quality of your narrative study in general. So you can reflect, this is a kind of reflection for you, for us as a narrative researcher, to ensure that our narrative research report is in a high quality manner or state. So we can, reflect and see this. If you think that you have fulfilled all, then you can guarantee that your research is having high quality, which means that it's very good piece of research report. Okay, so you can read this and you can reflect on what you have done in your research, and then again get back to what you have done and think and see whether or not you have offered a high quality piece of a research report. Okay, that's all. Yeah, Ilmi?
Yep, okay, so that's all, right?
Yeah, actually I still have one thing to share.
What's that?
Yeah, if I can show you this one, the thing that I said to you, this is the presentation of my report. I do not follow like a very conventional way of research report.
Okay.
So I create something a little bit different in this part. For example, okay, I start with the introduction. Yes, but then in the introduction, I do not only say it's introduction. You know, it's like writing a short story. So we can give any kind of words or, you know, a quotation in the beginning. That is really, really fine in a narrative research. What I do is just to add this one. So when I say introduction, I said my commitment for professional improvement as a teacher. So I give another thing in you know, embedded in the word introduction. So I put all there in the heading of, under the heading of introduction, and then come with the theory. I do not write that it is theoretical framework or literature review. I just put identity, investment, imagined and agency without any you know, subheading or whatever the name, but I just put the theory like this. But then because I know that context is important, so I try to highlight the context, because I know that there is no single conventions of writing, you know, or reporting our real narrative research. So I just, you know, build creativity on it. See, behind the scene, behind the scene noise participation in my narrative study. I'm actually speaking about or writing about the methodology, but I just don't write it as a methodology. And then noise life story, the focus, this is actually the focus of my study. Okay, critical incidents, and then themes in noise life story. So I'm doing thematic analysis, and then this is the themes that I found in the data, in the narrative. Noise miserable childhood, because it's about, you know, poverty, you know, tears and so on. And then a new life in Rangkas Bitung, the turning point, I said. So what I want to show to you is actually, it's all about creativity. Okay, and this is my stories. My stories is my autobiography that I derive from my own personal experience. I combine my narrative with noise narrative in one piece of narrative writing. So yeah, the idea of sewing that is actually is all about the creativity. There is no single, you know, rule saying that you have to follow a certain format of yeah.
How do you deal with
your
the reviewer?
Yes.
How do you deal with the reviewer? Right.
I haven't got the review yet. It's still under the process. I know that the review result will be very harsh. But I will learn from them. I know, but that's part of the creativity, and I refer to some references that I read during the process of writing this paper. Yeah.
Okay, so everyone, right? Should you have any comments or questions regarding all the materials we discussed today, feel free to raise your hand or open up your mic.
Does it have 10 minutes? Am I correct?
Yep. We still have 10 minutes for the question and answer.
Yeah, feel free to ask questions, or maybe to provide comments or ideas. What about even about this online course in general? There should be no problem because I'm part of the committee actually.
Yeah.
That
would be a reflection, right?
Yes, it's a reflection input for the development of this program in the future.
So from today's and yesterday's presentations, have you discussed about the limitations of narrative inquiry?
You are right.
Yeah.
You're right. Maybe that's very interesting to discuss the limitation. Maybe you can invite the audience or the participants to share their thought about the potential limitations of narrative inquiry.
Okay.
So if I have a question like, what do you think about the please.
Yeah, Bu Eric, go ahead.
Can I?
Oh yes, please.
Sure.
Okay. Hello, Mr. Udi.
Yes.
it's a very interesting topic to share here. And in my understanding from your explanation is that narrative inquiry is very much different with the analysis of narrative, right?
Yes.
So, and when I see the style of the writing, it's like telling a story and then many first person point of view, of course. Yeah.
Yes, you're right.
I, my, etc.
Yeah, you're right.
How do you prevent the bias? Yeah, prevent the subjectivity of this kind of research. Can you share this to us? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Get back to the issue of the nature of qualitative research in general. It is just very subjective. So the level of subjectivity in qualitative research is relatively high, especially in narrative inquiry that involve ourselves as the participant, like what I did, like what I have done. So I involve myself as a participant. So the issue of subjectivity is really there. Okay, that's very interesting question. How to reduce the bias? Okay. That's also what the reviewer asked me when I sent my first narrative study. How you ensure that there is no bias? What have you done? There is one strategy called thick description. So this thick description is one technique in narrative inquiry in particular and qualitative research in general in order to avoid bias. What we mean by thick description is that we provide a very holistic point of view and explanations of the finding that we claim is there in our research. So this thick description is a strategy that we use to minimize or to reduce the potentials of or the bias potential happening in our research. And the second one, like other qualitative research, we can get back to the issue of triangulation. So because I'm speaking about the struggle, the identity construction, there are a lot of previous studies discuss those, and that there are a lot of books that concern those. So I'm referring to those theories in even naming the finding. So these are strategies that we can use in order to answer or to respond to the issue of subjectivity and bias during data analysis process. And if you ask, it is very subjective, get back again to the issue of qualitative research. Subjectivity is part of the qualitative research. So even if you say that it is subjective, it is yes subjective. But again, you have to really tackle the issue of bias by saying you are doing a thick description of the finding and analysis, which is part of the strategy in narrative inquiry in general. And what I did and what I said in my paper that previously accepted was the triangulation and the thick description. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for this.
You are very welcome, Larry.
maybe this is also the questions of the other participants.
Yes.
Yeah,
but I think it's very good idea again. I think to get back to papers in narrative inquiry, every researchers would have different techniques in tackling the issue of bias in their studies. What I said about thick description is something that most researchers also do. There might be some other strategies that you can find in other papers that I think will be useful for your better understanding of the narrative inquiry thing. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome, Udi.
Thank you, Udi. So, but I think this more to emphasize how to avoid bias in narrative inquiry research, because it's qualitative research. It is subject. It could be very subjective, but we have one more strategy, that is thick description, isn't it?
Yes, you're right.
with descriptions. Okay, any other questions from the audience?
Actually, not the questions. It's a kinds of
Compliment?
a request, actually.
Request.
About because just to help our students to to have an idea to conduct research using narrative inquiry. Can you suggest a particular issues that our students can explore by using narrative inquiry for their thesis?
Okay, that's very good. Very good. Is it a request? You give me another burden in addition to this presentation.
Yeah, I'm sorry because I'm afraid that the students just silent because they are still thinking. So what is the link? Yeah, these topics and my thesis. They're still searching for ideas, I guess.
Yeah, you are right. If we get back,
represents the other participants, I think.
I think issues like identity construction of an English teacher, identity constructions of an English learner is, an issue that is still, I say prima donna or the darling of many editors. Because one of the basic idea of doing a narrative inquiry is that to really understand, the experience, how someone is moving from one stage to another. And identity is something that is developing, and then the narrative inquiry is trying to understand this process of shifting from one identity to another. So the very first issue was still related to identity constructions of English teachers, identity constructions of English students. I think that's the very first issue. The second one is understanding, the motivations of studying English, for example. This is, I believe, still something very interesting because motivation to everyone is different. Different meaning of motivation, different level of motivation would really encourage people in different way. So this angle could also be another issue that you can do in your narrative inquiry in the future. Another issue that so far I read is related to difficulties from moving from one culture to another. For example, to my own experience, I refer to the context of education culture. When I moved from the Asian education culture into Western education culture, this shift then something that we can really tell to people that there are a lot of values when we are experiencing this kind of shift from one area to another, from one different education tradition to another different tradition. Another issue could be like the journey as a student, as an English student. For example, when you are in your high school level in SMA, you didn't want to enter an English department, but now you are here in an English department. So what has driven you to be in the English department? That kind of journey that looks simple, but that provides you an insight of why you are choosing this. You really want to become a math teacher before, but then you are trapped in an English department and you are projected to be an English teacher. So how do you feel? This will be a new journey in the future. How do you struggle with that kind of situation? So, those kind of issues are very, very sexy issues in narrative inquiry. There are a lot more, but I think you have to pay more. Okay, so you have to give me more session in order to focus more on current issues in narrative inquiry, but I think those are still very sexy in narrative inquiry, sexy issues. Start with your own journey as a student of English. How do you struggle to study English? How do you deal with the lecturers who are different, there's different standards of assessment, different way of teaching. You can focus on those and you can tell in your narrative inquiry. You can make yourself as, source of data. You don't need to think someone else. Get back to you. That could be an author ethnography or an autobiography study. So you don't need to think about, going to a school and then do research.
Yeah.
You can do research at home, do it with yourself, make yourself as a source of data. That's research. You see?
Yeah, studying from yourself. Okay,
Yes.
well, one more question, Dr. Udi. It's
Yes.
from Adolfina. Can narrative inquiry be done as a part of research roadmap of language learning and teaching issue, since it may need further research to overcome or explore?
Well, I believe yes. I believe yes. This is a very potential research approach that I think you can use to map even your career. You can use this as a reflections of your career, for example, as a teacher. So if the question is whether or not this can be put as a roadmap, yes, this could be embedded with other research approaches. When you are conducting a classroom action research, for example, the trend is now for researchers to combine with the element of narrative. So in the process of data analysis, you can put, for example, narrative analysis that we have discussed previously in your action research. And that is something new and currently practiced by most teachers who are doing classroom action research, because stories cannot be avoided in our life. Teachers have stories, and then these stories could be put in your classroom action research report, and then could be made as one data analysis approach. So it can be one in the roadmap of your research career, or whatever it is termed, but it is very potential to be there.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Udi. So any more questions? I think because time is also up.
That's good.
Right, I think that was the last questions. Okay, right. I think it's been very interesting, very thought-provoking. I think learning about narrative inquiry research. It is something new, not only to me, but also to every one of you, perhaps. So I'm not going to wrap up of everything, because I think it goes back to you to reflect to your interpretations about narrative inquiry. And but as for today, Dr. Udi has given us so many insights about written narrative inquiry, elicitation method, right? And also how to analyze the data, right? And also still talking about the ethical issue, right? And so many things we learned from these 2 days, yesterday and also today, right? I think I would like to thank Dr. Udi for the presentations and also for the audience, right? And then I would like to close today's sessions. So you start sharing stories, right? Okay, and start giving smiles to everyone, right? Okay, thank you very much. Give a round of applause to Dr. Udi, right?
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, hand it over to Dr.
Thank
Dina.
you, Bu Eri and colleagues. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much for the sessions, Pak Ilmi and Pak Dr. Udi, and thank you very much also to all the participants, especially my biggest thanks to Ibu Adolfina and Rindu for your active participations. And to all participants, please, we still have one more sessions which will be with me on Thursday. Okay, so I'm shifting my role, from a coordinator become speakers. So it's not actually a KKN. I will clarify that later.
You can do narrative inquiry on that. You shift from a coordinator to a speaker.
I think it's a very good idea. Thank you very much. So I'll see you guys on Thursday. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very
How are you,
much,
Bu Ina,
everyone.
Bu
Thank
Ilmu,
you.
and Pak Ilmi?
Bye. Yes, thank you.